The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Inventor 101 session. Let me see if I can get the camera turned on here. There we go. Thank you for joining us for another session of Inventor 101. Appreciate everybody that came out last week. And just as a reminder, this is going to be a weekly series, probably till right about June 29th. And we're going to cover everything you need to know to get started using Autodesk Inventor. This week, we're going to focus in really heavily on sketching best practices. We'll be doing some features as well. So stay tuned, and we're going to get started right now. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, let me get out of my PowerPoint presentation. So if you missed last week, we talked about setting up projects and data and those sorts of things. So make sure you check that video out. I'll make sure I get a link to it somewhere in the chat window. Also, if you have any questions, my partner in crime, James, is actually sitting in on this as well, and he's going to be helping answer questions, or he's going to interrupt me and help me answer questions as well. So if you have questions, ask them as we go, and we'll do our best to answer them. So jumping right in, we're talking all about parts, all about sketching, and part modeling. So I'm going to start a brand new part file. I just realized that I started an English file, so let's change this over to a new metric file. So I'll start a new metric millimeter IPT file. And we talked about this last week a little bit, and it's the idea of building your geometry on 0, 0, 0. So if we go to our browser, that's this panel over here on the left-hand side. If we make all of these visible, I'm going to hit F6 to go to an isometric view. This center point right here is the 0, 0, 0 of this part file, and it's really important that you build your geometry on 0, 0, 0. And this helps when you create assemblies, whenever you're doing drawings. It helps no matter what you're doing. So the first thing you want to do when you're creating your geometry is, first of all, determine which sketch plane you want to build this in. And you have all different options. X, Y is a typical one. So I'm just going to start a brand new sketch. But before I do that, one thing I want to share with you is the way I'm issuing my command. So I could come up here and I could hit, start a sketch. I could actually, use a mini toolbar, but I'm a typer. I've been using Inventor for years and AutoCAD since way back when, like 12, 13, 14 era. And I do a lot of typing. So anytime you hover over a command and you see a letter in parentheses. So you see that 2D sketch parenthesis S. That means if you just hit the S command, it's going to issue the command for you. You don't have to hit enter. That's why it's super fast. So I'm just going to hit S for sketch. You can see it actually issues my sketch command. I'm going to pick the plane I want to work in. And Inventor by default orients your sketch so you're looking directly at it, because that's obviously the easiest way to draw your geometry. And it projects by default the 0, 0, 0 point. And this is important because when you start to draw geometry, you want to make sure that it's somehow dimensioned or constrained to 0, 0, 0. So the first thing I want to introduce you to is the sketch panel. So last week we only hit a little bit of this. We're going to talk in more detail about all the different stuff inside of the sketch panel. So going from left to right, obviously the line command, and when you hit any of these down arrows, there's tons of options within each command. So you can draw lines, arcs, splines, all types of options, equation curves, if you have the equation to plug in for that curve. Same thing with circle, and anytime you see any of these with a pull down, it gives you different options. One thing that it's not new, but it's new to me. I've been using Inventor for years. This rectangle command, these slot commands, I'm not going to say they're new. They've been in there for multiple releases, but way back when I first started using Inventor, there wasn't a slot command. So you would always have to do a 2-point rectangle, add circles to the end, and I still do that just out of habit. But if you're doing anything with slots or slots that are curved, make sure you use the slot command underneath the rectangle. A couple other things, so fillets, text, center points, some pretty basic. These here are all of your creation commands. You can see it's listed underneath create. Next to the right is the project geometry. This projects any existing geometry in your 3D model. Project cut edges, so wherever that plane passes through your object. I'm going to show all this to you in a minute. So those are the basic geometry creation tools. So let's go ahead and make a few things here. And I'm just going to start out with a simple rectangle. And again, I could, if I wanted, create a shortcut for this, but you don't see that parenthesis R for rectangle because R probably does something else. So I'm going to issue the command up here, and I'm just going to draw this out in space to show you the way you want to constrain this. So remember, this is 0, 0, 0 right here, and I want to add a few dimensions to this. So there's something also called constraints, and all of these here are your constraints. So you have coincident constraints, you have collinear, concentric, you can fix things at a specific location, parallel, perpendicular. These are basically all geometric conditions that you should all probably know, hopefully. But the idea is you want to use constraints in combination with dimensions. I could come in here and dimension this, so I'm just going to hit D for dimension, or I could issue the dimension command right here. I'm going to dimension from here to here, and I'm going to say this is going to be, 15 millimeters, and this is going to be 10 millimeters. And now what I want to do is center this. I could dimension and say from, this point to this edge, helps if I pick the geometry correctly, from this point to this edge, and I could say that's going to be a specific distance. From one to the next. I could say that this is going to be 15 divided by 2. That's the other really cool thing about your dimensions. It understands mathematical equations. So if I just do 15 divided by 2, it's going to say 7.5. So any mathematical equation that you can do, if it shows up in red, that means it's not recognizing it, or it might be too complicated, or it might not be a correct equation. But make sure you use those equations. This is an okay way to dimensions, but not the right way. So I'm just going to delete this dimension, and I could come in here and I could dimension this, and I could say from here to here. And rather than typing in a dimension, I could pick the 15. So this 15 millimeter, and I could divide that by 2. Again, a mathematical process. So you see that says D0, that's the parameter equation for that particular dimension. So you can see now it says fx, it knows it's an equation, equals 7.5. Now check this out. Whenever I edit 15, so if I change 15 to 22, that dimension automatically updates and it stays centered. This is getting a little bit better, but it's still probably not the best way to dimension this or locate this. What you want to do is you want to use a combination of dimensions and constraints. So I'm going to delete this again. I'm going to move this piece of geometry over a little bit. And what you want to use is constraints. And this is a super easy way to lock things in place. You could add the constraints at the beginning. You could add the constraints at the end. I tend to mix and match. So I'm going to do a horizontal and vertical constraints on this. So I'm going to say I need a vertical constraint from this center point to this midpoint of this line. You can see it highlight. And now those 2 points are vertical one to another. I'm going to add a horizontal constraint from this point to that midpoint. The other thing too you're going to notice when you're doing this is your geometry changes colors. So now my geometry is dark blue. If I try to move it, so I just hit escape, that cancels any command that you happen to be in. But when I try to move my geometry, it stays still. If I delete these dimensions, you'll see my geometry starts to change color. It goes from a dark blue to a light blue. Now whenever I go to change this, look what happens. Because I built this geometry on 0, 0, 0 with constraints, it stays perfectly centered no matter what I do. So I can come in, add those dimensions, and complete this. I'm going to make an extrusion. So I'm going to tie these together. So I'm going to go issue my dimension command again. I'm going to say this is going to be 22. And let's say you know the height of this is always half of that. Go back to that command I showed you before. So you issue dimension. Rather than typing in 11, again, this is some intelligence you're building into your model. I'm going to pick on the 22, and I'm going to divide that by 2. So now, again, because I built that intelligence, let's say this version happens to be 12, everything changes automatically for you. I'm going to go to an isometric view. That's just hitting F6 on your keyboard, and I'm going to hit extrude. So I could finish the sketch and then issue extrude. I could come over to the 3D model tab and hit extrude. But again, I'm all about doing things fast and kind of the best way possible, in my opinion, the quickest way possible. And that's just going to be E for extrude. So it issues the extrude command. By default, the extrude command goes in the positive direction. You can flip it and push it the other way. You can do a mid-plane extrusion here. The same rules apply. So while I'm in this extrude command, if I wanted to highlight that dimension, and let's say now the extrusion is related to one of the other dimensions that already exist. So I can actually highlight that 10 millimeters. I can say that this is going to be this dimension. So it's going to be the exact same as that one. And maybe it's half of that. So it's going to be D5 divided by 2. So now what I have is this super intelligent component that quickly and easily changes. So now if I look at my browser and I go to Sketch 1 and I just double click to edit it, if this version now happens to be 22, everything I do, I'm going to just finish my edit, everything automatically updates. So anytime you know how your parts are going to behave, how different extrusions and sketches and features work together, make sure you build that intelligence in using, again, a combination of constraints and those formulas that we talked about when you're creating your dimensions. So let's go back to this sketch. We're going to add some more geometry in here. So every now and then I get the question about, when do I put different features into a sketch and when do I make the decision to do it as a feature? For example, I could come in here and I could draw a circle and I'm going to dimension that circle. This is going to be 3 millimeters. I could dimension it from the edge, and that's going to be 3 millimeters, and from this edge it's going to be 3 millimeters. Now whenever I change my extrusion, so let's edit this feature, I could come in here and I could pick that profile and I could include the circle as a part of the sketch. And that's an okay way of doing things, but the problem is, what if you want to edit that circle now? So if you want to edit that circle now, you notice in your browser you don't see a circle feature or a hole or anything like that. So you have to go back into the sketch and edit the sketch and change that dimension to be whatever you want it to be. Finish the sketch, and now the hole has updated. And this is probably maybe some legacy workflow that maybe if you were using, perhaps like 2D AutoCAD or anybody that's been around since the mechanical desktop days. But we have really specific features that help you build your geometry. So the way I would do this is I wouldn't actually have that hole there. And I'm going to update my extrusion. It didn't know what to do because the hole was removed and it thought it still wanted to use it. So if the rule of thumb that I use is if you have a three-dimensional feature, so if we come over to this model tab here at the top, you can see all the different three-dimensional feature tools that you have access to. So you have extrude, revolve, sweep, loft, coil. all the way down to deleting faces and those sorts of things. So the rule of thumb, if there's a 3D feature that allows you to create that particular piece of geometry, use the feature rather than the sketch. So for instance, that hole I wanted there, I would issue the hole command, and this is an intelligent hole command. It's not just a circular extrusion, because we can do things like making it countersink, spot face, counter board. We can add threads to these, whatever we want to do. But I'm going to place the hole on that face. I'm going to dimension it from that edge, 3 millimeters. And now, whenever I edit this feature, and I could have dimensioned it more completely, so I will make that 3 millimeters as well, and I'm going to make this hole maybe a spot face or maybe a counter bore. And now I have this intelligent hole. Again, if you folks have questions during this, please make sure that you reach out with any questions you might have. Again, James is on the line handling questions. He might throw a question in as we're doing this live, but make sure you ask questions. Anything you want to see again, something I'm missing, whatever it might be, just ask that question and we'll do our best to get it answered. So the cool thing, getting back to the model now, is if you look in the browser, I actually have a hole command that I can actually edit. So this is an intelligent feature. So if I right click on this and I edit feature, I can change everything about this hole. I can switch over and make this a tapped hole. Anything I want to do with this particular hole, I can do. Once we make these modifications to the holes, to whatever we want to do, it's going to really easily allow us to make those updates. So I can change this to an ANSI metric profile. I can choose a different size. Whatever I want to do, I can do in this hole command. So make sure you use those intelligent features inside rather than just doing things with a sketch. So getting back to some sketching tools, so we're going to go and create a brand new metric part file again. We'll start something new. I want to talk about using, again, that origin plane. So I'm going to put a sketch right on that origin plane. And the other thing you might want to think about is using what are called center lines. So rather than drawing lines and trying to revolve about them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to issue my 2-point rectangle, and let's say I need to make some kind of cylindrical object. Actually, let's change this up. Let's do a quick line command, and let's say we need to make this is going to be a revolved component. So rather than doing 2 or 3 separate features, I'm going to revolve this around 0, 0, 0. I'm going to dimension it best I can, and I'm just kind of making up some of the dimensions here. 4 millimeters. This is going to be 15 millimeters. This is going to be 4 as well. 4 as well. I'm going to do an angle between here and here. When I add this angle, you're going to see that this is going to say that I'm going to over constrain the sketch. That's because I fully define the sketch with all my other dimensions. So I can hit accept, and when you do this, this is called a driven dimension, and it's okay to have driven dimensions on there. What they do is they show you what the dimension is without you defining it. So that 24.99 angle is a result of all the other dimensions I created. So if I change this to 3 and I change this to 3, you can see that dimension automatically updates. It's nice to have those driven dimensions on there sometimes because you may use them for reference later on at some point. So I am going to make this point here and this point here horizontal, one to another, so it's exactly on 0, 0. So now I want to revolve this around this axis, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line that's going to represent my center axis, and when I go to do revolve, it picks up the profile, but it doesn't know what I want to revolve about. What I can do is if I make this line a center line, so if I cross over it or I pick the line, this is where we start to get into construction geometry. So I'm going to change this from a regular line to a center line. You'll see the line updates. It turns into a center line visually on the screen. Now when I do revolve, it knows exactly what I want to do, but I'm missing something here, and that is my last dimension for my diameter of the inside or the outside, whichever way I'm dimensioning it. And I'm going to do an internal ID. So when I pick this center point, and here, watch what it does. It knows that's a center point. It knows that I'm probably going to revolve about it, and it gives me a diameter dimension for that particular piece of geometry. So I'm going to say that's going to be 23. And here's the neat thing. Let's say you were doing this with a bunch of concentric diameters. I could get rid of that 15 millimeter, and I could dimension from the center line to that outside edge and say that this is going to be 53 millimeters. And now I am fully defined. When I issue my revolve command, it automatically picks up my profile. It automatically picks up my center point. And basically all I have to do is click OK to create my revolve. So you can start to see here, whenever you start to combine center lines and you start to combine other types of construction lines and using constraints and using formulas in your dimensions, you can make your components super intelligent. So the next thing I want to do is create some additional components on here. Maybe I want to add a neck to this, or a boss sticking out from the side. So I'm going to go to that origin plane, this XY plane. I'm going to create a new sketch. And what I want to do is punch a hole maybe right in the side of this. So what I can do is hit F7. This is a really cool command that slices the graphics wherever your sketch happens to be. And I want to pick up all of this edge right here when I do my project geometry. So I'm going to do what's called project cut edges. That's going to automatically take all of these edges. You can kind of see it here. They highlight in a green color. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them into construction, because if I try to do an extrude now, it picks them up, or revolve. And this is really just to help me locate other geometry. So I'm going to just hover over, do a crossing over top of all that geometry, and construction is right here. So what happens is Inventor knows to use that geometry for construction purposes only. So if I try to issue an extrude command now, there's nothing to extrude. It's just a bunch of construction geometry. So what I'm going to do now is start to create some additional features. So we're going to create a more complex feature here. I'm going to do a line from this midpoint here to this midpoint here. You can see it's kind of at this funny angle, and what I want to do is I want to revolve maybe a hole through this, or some type of geometry through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a 3-point rectangle. This is another cool way of drawing a rectangle that's not oriented orthographically. So I'm just going to start it here. I'm going to go to there. And what I can do now is dimension this. I can come in here and add any other kind of geometry that I want to do with this. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. When you're dimensioning an object that's at an angle, you're going to notice when you issue the dimension command and you pick the line, you're going to get a couple different options. So if I just drag to the right or I drag straight up, I get orthographic dimensions, so the dimension in the X and Y. But when I'm really close to the object, you see that parallel dimension come up. And if you get too far away, you might miss it. But if I know what that parallel dimension is, when I see it, it now allows me to dimension it in that orientation. So we'll go to 2.5. You can see that pulled off of there. That's totally fine. I'm going to use some construction, or some constraints rather, to lock this in. So I'm going to do a coincident constraint between the midpoint of this line and the midpoint of this line that locks it in. I'm going to dimension, I hit the extrude, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to dimension this line right here. I'm going to do a parallel dimension, and I just want it to be big enough to make sure that when I revolve, it goes through that particular object. So I'm just going to leave that at 20. That's probably more than enough. And I'm going to take that line and turn that into a center line. So now when I hit my revolve, it automatically picks it up. I can change that to a cutting operation, so it's going to remove material for me. And now I have this, again, more complicated location of a hole. So you can see how using construction geometry, center lines, using that parallel dimensioning is really going to help you when you're creating those more complicated sketches. Again, if you have any questions, just put those in the chat window, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered. So the next thing I want to do is now I want to start to reuse some of the geometry that I created. And I could go in and create multiple versions of this, but let's say I know how many of these I have that run around this object. I have an obvious center point, so I'm going to use a circular pattern command. So now we're starting to get into some of the 3D features that you're going to leverage when you're using Autodesk Inventor. So I'm going to do a circular pattern. The first thing pretty much any of our tools do for you when you first initiate them is, what do you want to work with? What feature do you want? I can pick it in the browser. I can pick it in the window. Sometimes you pick in the browser if you have a really complicated model that has all kinds of stuff on it. Sometimes it's difficult to just grab the one thing you want. You can pick it either way. So there is what I'm working with. The next thing it asks you for is the rotation axis. I'll pick that center axis. Helps if I pick it correctly. Let's try that again. So I'm going to pick that. My rotation axis is going to be the center. You can see I get a preview of that, and I can choose to create this based on a number of placements. I can say that those placements are going to happen over 365 degrees. And there is the beginning of your, again, more complicated component. So again, make sure you're using those constraints. And we're going to jump back to a part maybe you saw me talk about earlier this week. Hey, what's up, James?
We have a question here, and that's how do you reorient the sketch plane parallel to the screen? What was the shortcut for it?
Oh, so it happens by default when you do it. So if I want to sketch on this plane right here, the XZ plane, so if I do a new sketch on that, Inventor by default orients to that particular orientation for you. If you go up to your tools and you go to application options and sketch, there is two options that you may have turned off, and depending on how old your version of Inventor is, I know the newer versions have this on. What you want to do is you want to make sure that auto project part origin on sketch create is checked on. That way it'll automatically always project the center point so you know where that is in your sketch. And you also want to do this point alignment. This will make sure that when you create your sketch, it aligns it so you're looking at it in that flat orientation. So whoever asked that question, great question, because what I find myself doing is I'll create a sketch and I always end up rotating it flat. If you have these two options on, it will, I'm sorry, I mentioned the wrong one. It's the look at, my bad. I was doing point alignment. You want to make sure that look at sketch plane on sketch create in the part environment is on and in the assembly environment. Those are the two that you want to make sure you have on, and the auto project, not the point alignment.
One other question while we're here.
Shoot.
Why did you not use the hole feature to make that hole, other than because we're looking to use sketching in this webinar?
Yeah, so I wanted to show some of the 3D features, but one of the reasons why this particular hole on the side was I could have used a hole command and I could have located a hole on that tangent face. Again, I'm all about creating things as quickly as I can. I could have done that. It would have just taken, it would have taken a little more effort. I would have had to create a tangent work plane, and we're going to talk about work planes next week. But I would have had to create additional geometry to get a hole, right on that side face tangent. It just would. We can do it, and next week we'll make sure we cover that when we talk about work planes and work axes. But that's a great question. We will definitely cover that next week, so make sure you come back for that one. But we definitely could have. Any other questions, James?
Nope, that's everything. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're going to, again, jump into another brand new part. I want to make sure that we get a lot of these sketching tools out of the way. Sketching tools. So again, whenever I go to my XY plane, I'm going to do a new sketch. A couple other tools that you're going to see and you're going to be working with is when you're in the line command, it's not just the line command. It's pretty cool how it works. So let's say I want to draw kind of a relatively complicated curved component that has combinations of straight edges and curved edges. When I'm in the line command, I'm going to just pick a point to start, pick a point to end. Here's another tip. I gave this one a few weeks ago, but it's called dimensioning as you go. So you see that dimension of 26 whatever millimeters, rather than just drawing this and doing this and then going back and dimensioning it later, which it's okay, but the better way to do this is when you are sketching your line. If I know this line is going to be 20 millimeters, just type in 20 and hit enter. You're still in the line command. It doesn't cancel the command. It just makes that line 20 millimeters. Since I was parallel when I created it, it adds a parallel constraint, or a horizontal constraint rather, and it keeps me in the command, adds a dimension. So great way to add those dimensions as you go and get those constraints created. It takes a step out of the process. And if you're doing this every day, you want to eliminate as many steps as you can and make this as fast as you can. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of gesture-based sketching. So I'm in the line command still, but let's say I want to start to draw some curved objects. Maybe I'm going to do a sweep, and this is going to be the center or the path for a sweep I'm going to do. When I'm on this endpoint, I'm going to pick and hold. So it's a left mouse click, and if I drag down and to the right, it takes you into an arc command automatically. If I drag back and to the left, back and down, you can see, and I'm keeping the button held down the whole time, you can see all the different kind of permutations you have to do this. I'm just going to drag to the right and down. You'll see a constraint pops up where that endpoint is. I can add some additional geometry. This is going to be 20 as well. I'm going to create another curve here. I'm going to make this 20 as well. I'm going to add dimensions for those two fillets that I created. So I'm just going to add a dimension. This is going to be 10 millimeters and 10 millimeters. And because this is going to be a sketch that I'm then going to use to create a, let's say, a sweep on, this is a command we'll cover in more detail next week, I just need to think about where I want the center of this sweep to start. So all I'm going to do is a coincident constraint from this endpoint to 0, 0, 0. You can see I still need a few more dimensions to this, and the reason is this can still be moved. That tangent didn't get picked up whenever I drew it. I was a little sloppy when I did it. So that's a tip that I'll give you. If you don't know what's wrong with your sketch, let's say, for why it's not fully constrained, just grab an endpoint and kind of drag it around. It'll show you where you need to do things. So I need a tangent constraint there. So I'll go to my constraints. Tangent is right there. So I will pick the curve and the line. And I also need a tangent constraint here. You can see I can pull that up and it kind of gets a little wonky on me. So I will put a tangent constraint on that as well. And you see that now it's fully constrained. It's dark blue. You can see it says fully constrained in the lower right-hand corner. I'm going to finish the sketch because to do a sweep, you actually need two sketches. So I'm going to finish my sketch. I'm going to hit F6 to go to my isometric view. And because I built this on 0, 0, I have this YZ plane right here that I want to work with. So it's that point is on YZ. So I'm going to do a new sketch there. The line goes away because I'm looking directly at it. Every now and then you'll want to look at your geometry kind of in an isometric view. So I'm just going to rotate just a little bit, and I want to draw a circle right on that endpoint. Remember, it projected 0, 0, 0 for me automatically because I had that turned on. So I'm going to draw a circle. I'm going to say that circle is going to be 6 millimeters. Totally blue because I started on 0, 0, 0. Now, whenever I go to do my sweep command, I could hit Control-Shift-S. That's kind of a long keystroke, so I'm just going to issue it from the 3D model tool. It picks up the profile that it wants to sketch. It's asking for the path, and there is your swept geometry now. So in some cases you're using 2 and 3 sketches. You might be doing a Loft Command, which we'll talk about next week, where you have 2 sketches and a path. So you have 3 sketches to create the geometry you want. So it's not always sketch, extrude, sketch, revolve. You might be mixing and matching those tools. So another thing I want to mention, and I know we're getting close on time here, we're going to probably go right about 45 minutes, so about 10 more minutes and we'll wrap up. I want to make sure if you have any questions we get those answered too. Keep those coming in. Is how do you set up those shortcuts? I want to make sure we talk about that because you may want to customize your shortcuts. So if you go into your tools, so at the top if you go to tools, this one is in customize. And when you're inside of the Customize window, this is where you customize your user interface. So you can customize the ribbon and do whatever you want to do with the ribbon. You can actually customize and make your own marking menu if you'd like to use the marking menus. I'm a typer, so 95%, 90% of what I'm doing is actually typing on the keyboard. You know, L for line, E for extrude, R for revolve, D for dimension. But if you want to customize these, anytime you see the key and then you see the command, that is what the keystroke is for that. So for instance, as I'm scrolling down here, if I want to go to, let's actually go to a specific category. So let's go to sketching. This allows you to filter down to just sketching tools. So let's go down to sketch tools. So now these are all the different tools you have access to in the sketch environment, and you can see you have a hatch, you have L for line, O for offset. If you want to create your own, like so 2-point rectangle is something I do all the time. So 2-point rectangle is right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a 2P for 2-point rectangle, and if it doesn't take, that means it's used by another command. So it did take. I'm going to hit apply and OK. So now this is a something that happens over the course of the what am I trying to say here? It's something that happens all the time in Inventor. So this isn't a one-time thing for this part file. So when I go to create a new part file, and I want to do a sketch, S for sketch, on this plane, and I want to do a 2-point rectangle, I just do 2P, it issues my 2-point rectangle command for me, and now I have a 2-point rectangle without hunting for the command, without looking for anything else. I can come in here and I can dimension this, whatever size I want to dimension this. I can constrain the 0, 0 to the 0, 0, and super quickly I can take that information and customize any of those commands that I want to customize. So make sure you customize your keystrokes. It's the fastest way to use Inventor. In my opinion, I think it's one of the fastest, best ways to use it, especially if you're new. If you already have a way of using Inventor, by all means, continue to use it that way. I'm going to do E for extrude, and we're going to do a few more features, and then we're going to talk about parameters for a second. So we're going to issue the extrude command. A cool thing with the extrude command, it's relatively new, depending on how long you've been using Inventor, is we have an asymmetric extrusion. So we've always had one direction, other direction symmetry, but the asymmetrical, it's been a few releases that you've been able to do this, but it gives you 2 different options. The other thing too is you can kind of pick and drag these and put them wherever you want. So you can actually come in here and drag the arrows wherever you want to drag them to make those longer. You can key in the dimensions inside the dialog box, whichever way you want to do that. I'm going to change that back to a 0 for my taper. But a really quick, easy way to do an asymmetrical extrusion, because that happens all the time, right? So now that we have this part done, the next thing I want to talk quickly about is using your parameters. So I'm going to go way back to this part right here.
Hey Luke, while you're jumping back into that, could you give us a quick answer for this one? It's a good general question, and that's leaving your sketches fully constrained or not fully constraining them. How does that affect the model down the road for 3D modeling?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as much as possible, you want to constrain your sketches 100%. Obviously, if you're developing a product and you don't know the exact shape and size and you might have to change it later, you can leave it unconstrained. It usually doesn't cause any problems when you go to use it in the assembly mode unless you have adaptivity turned on, and that's something we're going to talk about a couple sessions from now. But usually you want to keep it fully constrained. It can cause problems a little bit within the part file if you start to create geometry off of a non-fully constrained model, and then you go in and start to refine that model. If you built it on something that was undefined and then it gets defined, things could move around. So best practice, keep it constrained if possible. You may need to leave things off. Sometimes what I'll do is I will put dimensions on just for holding it in position. That way you don't have to worry about running into any of those problems. So rule of thumb, keep them constrained fully. Alrighty, so a couple things I want to talk about here now is I want to talk about parameters. So parameters are something, this is getting a little more advanced, but parameters are something that I highly recommend every Inventor user gets to know. This is going to make everything you do much, much faster. It's also a way to customize your components. There's all kinds of downstream things that you can do with these parameters. Whenever you go to connect this to something like Configurator 360, it can automatically generate different variations based off your parameters. If you're creating eye parts, which we'll talk about in a later session, eye parts allow you to do a family of components based off of one general component that allows you to scale things up and scale things down and change things. So you can see model parameters, D4, D5, and if you remember this first model we did, it shows you where it's used, the sketch. It shows you which sketch it was used in. It'll tell you what extrusion it's used in, and it lists all of the math. If you happen to do some formulas, you can see, D4 divided by 2, 22 millimeters, D5 divided by 2, but you can create your own and use those for creating your model. So let's say I want to create a user parameter. I'm going to add a user parameter, and I'm going to call this, let's say, top, and top is going to be 22 millimeters, and I'm going to add another one, and this is going to be side, and this is going to be top divided by 2. And I'm going to add another one, and this is going to be, back, and this is going to be, we'll say, side divided by 2. So basically, I'm replacing these with these D values. So now what I can really easily do is I can come in here and I can say that this is actually that parameter. I can either do it in here. I'm going to back out of here and do it in my sketch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this, and I could list my parameters if I wanted to. I could list them and say this is going to be the top, which equals 22. This is going to be the side. Whoop, did those two backwards. This is going to be the back. Whoop, I must have did these wrong. Let's just do this way. We'll do that guy divided by 2. And finish my sketch. So now what I'm doing is I'm using my parameters to drive that model. And whenever I go to create an eye part, or I'm doing anything with Config 360, we're doing different variations, all of that parameter information comes over automatically. So make sure you leverage parameters. I just want to make sure I'm looking at what I wanted to cover today. So we talked about the sketch panel, we talked about constraints, construction geometry, dimensions, we talked about some of the modify tools, parameters, and shortcut keys. So that's it for today. That is our 45 minutes of Inventor 101. Make sure you sign up for next week's webinar. These are going to be Thursdays at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard. Pretty much indefinitely. The 101 series is going to run through June 29th, so make sure you sign up for that. I believe it's in the chat window. I think James helped me out, so if you want to sign up for the series, that way you'll be sure you're not going to miss any of them. We're going to cover part modeling in more detail. We'll wrap up sketching next week, get into a lot of part modeling. Then we'll start to talk about I-parts. We'll talk about assemblies. We'll talk about assembly constraints, and all the way through on the 29th is when we're going to probably start to wrap things up, talking about drawings, bill of materials, and all those sorts of things. So again, thank you for attending, and I will see you next week for Inventor 101. Have a great day.